Do you fear the unknown? Or do you run into the dark abyss to greet it? Welcome to a special spooky season edition of True Drew Podcast, where we'll be discussing Nancy Drew books of a ghostly nature. So if you enjoy strolling through graveyards at night, whispers through the fog, the creak of a footstep on the stairs, or the chill that runs down your spine, you've come to the right place. So sit back and relax, if you can. Lock your doors and prepare yourself for some very haunting mysteries. Hey guys, and welcome to a bonus episode of True Drew Podcast. I got this idea a couple weeks ago, and I thought, what better way to get in the mood for Halloween than to do some really spooky episodes of the podcast. So, as you know, I've kind of been going in chronological order with the Nancy Drew books, but I was looking at some of the books on my shelf the other day, and there's quite a few that are kind of their own series or like spin-off books of the Nancy Drew books, and so these books are the ones that we're going to be covering in the next 3 bonus episodes, which are going to be releasing for the next couple of Mondays leading up to Halloween. So, the books we're going to be covering are Nancy Drew Ghost Stories Volume 1. That's what we're going to be talking about today on this episode. Nancy Drew Ghost Stories Volume 2. That'll be the next bonus episode. And then the final bonus episode will be on the Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys Campfire Stories book. Now, all 3 of these books came out in the 1980s, and each book has about 5 or 6 stories within the one book. So these are going to be longer episodes, and I think what I'm going to do to break it up and so it's easier to find your place if you're not able to listen to the whole episode in one sitting, I'm going to put a sound effect in like this. So that way you'll have an easier way to pick up where you left off. Also, if I'm being completely honest, I just really want to use these Halloween sound effects because they're so cool. Also, I wanted to just give a little shout out to Lynne, who won the copy of Nancy Drew Ghost Stories Volume 1. If you follow me on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, I did a giveaway over there, and it was so cool to see all these people send in their different pictures of their favorite spooky Nancy Drew books. So yeah, if you're not following me on Instagram, you should, because sometimes I give away free books over there. But if you missed that giveaway, don't worry. I also have a lot of the Nancy Drew books for sale up on my website, which is www.truedrewpodcast.com. All right, well, I think that about covers it, and we're ready to dive into Nancy Drew Ghost Stories Volume 1 today. So this edition of Ghost Stories came out in 1983, and there are several different stories within this one book. So the stories included in this book are The Campus Ghost, The Ghost Dogs of Whispering Oaks, Blackbeard's Skull, The Ghost Jogger, The Curse of the Frog, and The Greenhouse Ghost. So as always, we're going to discuss the book covers for this book like we do on the regular episodes of the podcast, and these book covers for these spooky episodes I'm going to be posting on Sundays before the episodes come out on Monday. So if you want to see what these various book covers look like, you can check out my Instagram. So the first edition of this book cover, I have a couple editions of this, one that I gave away and one that I have on my own bookshelf, but the one that I have is dark purple, and it's got Nancy Drew Ghost Stories in the top left corner in like this green color. And there's a tagline, and it says, "Can Nancy survive the unearthly spirits that seem to haunt her every move?" So to the left of Nancy on this cover are 4 ghost dogs. They're shadowy dog figures, and they have their mouths open wide. They have really sharp teeth, and they have these creepy glowing yellow eyes. And yes, if you're already thinking this, if you've played the Nancy Drew computer game Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake, the story in this book, The Ghost Dogs of Whispering Oaks, is where the inspiration came from for that game. Another couple things on this cover, we have a branch of a tree behind Nancy. We see an owl perched up there behind her, very spooky. But Nancy herself is wearing like these high-waisted jeans. She's got a really cool belt on. It looks like it's like a gold kind of leaf type belt. I feel like I had a belt like this at one point, but she's wearing like a red button-down shirt over a turtleneck, and we got to talk about Nancy's hair here. So of course this book came out in the 80s, but Nancy kind of has the feathered, teased hair. It kind of looks like a mullet to me. I don't know why. It's just always looked like, you know, what is it they say? Business in the front, party in the back. It's got all the 80s vibes, and I'm here for it. And the next edition of this Ghost Stories cover, it's a light blue book, and Nancy Drew and Ghost Stories are in the top left corner again, but it looks looks like it's been ripped away, and the cover looks like it's got a big hole in it, and it's orange. It's very neat looking. And the tagline on this one is just 6 bone-chilling tales of mystery and terror. And on this cover, there's a shadowy figure to the left of Nancy that's kind of a little bit hard to make out. It's a very dark looking cover. Nancy herself is in the foreground, and she's got like this chalice in front of her with all these like vapors coming out. It looks like ghostly spirits or something. Nancy, of course, looks very startled. She looks scared. And to the right of her are the glowing eyes of the ghost dogs. And in the top right corner is this woman. I'm assuming this is the woman from the Campus Ghost story, but she's got this long flowing white hair, and she's holding something. I don't know if it's supposed to be a walkie-talkie. I really don't know, but she looks very sinister looking. And then the third and final edition of this cover is, I believe, came out in the early 2000s. It looks like that format because Ghost Stories and Nancy Drew is in larger text at the top, and Nancy's silhouette is super zoomed in. Like, we see part of her face and her magnifying glass on the cover, and in the parts between those, we see a person with a cape on, a woman with long hair and really long fingernails. She's holding a candle. There's the ghost dogs. It's like little pieces of each story have been superimposed on the book cover. And Nancy herself has her hair up in a ponytail. She's got a scrunchie on. Looks like a leather jacket. Like, her style has been updated a little bit. So I came up with a funny cover spoof using the first cover, the 80s one, the super 80s one, and I said, Nancy and the Case of the Mysterious Mullet. It's probably a really hair-raising mystery, if you know what I mean. And as far as a cover rating for all of these different book cover editions, I would give it a 4 to 5 magnifying glass rating. I think all of these are really, really cool and just fun to look at. Now, a few things that I thought I would cut from these bonus episodes. I'm not going to do a newspaper headline synopsis or add that to your resume, but I will still read off the characters, give a brief synopsis, discuss notes here, and also do a What's Cooking segment. So we begin with our first story, The Campus Ghost. So some of the characters in this book include Bess and George, Professor Sophie Hanks, Dean Tapley, who's the head of the science department, Professor Abel Martin, Sophie's friend, Alice Durand, who claims to be Sophie's niece, Carson and Hannah, Vanessa Lee, who's another friend of Sophie Hanks, Mr. and Miss Bascombe, who are owners of Sophie's apartment, and Dr. Craig, who recommended Vanessa for her new job. So here's a brief synopsis of The Campus Ghost. Bess and George urge Nancy to solve the mystery of Claremont College, which is supposedly haunted by Professor Sophie Hanks, who taught science there. 5 years previous, she had a car accident on a stormy night. Her car went off the road into a creek, and she has never been seen since. But a figure wearing a gray cape, much like she did in life, has been spotted around the campus, and a ghostly light has been seen turning on in her laboratory. To make things more interesting, Sophie made an important scientific discovery before her death/disappearance. Can Nancy solve the case? So now let's jump into the direct quotes and notes that I took down for The Campus Ghost. So our story starts with Bess and George saying they saw a ghostly gray cloaked figure at Claremont College, and they were there for some kind of a concert, but they think it's the ghost of the missing Professor Sophie Hanks. Already, this story is getting off to a really spooky start, but they tell Nancy about this encounter with this cloaked figure, and then they go to a dance, but Nancy takes Togo with her to the college to investigate, which I thought this was so cute. I love whenever Togo gets to be a part of Nancy's mystery solving. Togo's actually described as a bull terrier here, which is mostly what he's described as in the books, but sometimes there's variations on that. He's just a terrier and not specifically a bull terrier. But they go to the college, and while they're there on the campus, they see the light come on in Sophie Hanks' laboratory. So Nancy goes to find a security guard, and they go into the science building together. But when they get there, nobody's there. So they're baffled because no one's there, but there's these test tubes laying out as if someone was just about to do an experiment. And the security guard says that the lab has been empty since Sophie Hanks left, and the door was locked, so he doesn't understand how someone got in. Now, sidebar, I found this a little bit difficult to believe because what college wouldn't use an empty room? You know, like usually they're starved for space for their classes and everything. But maybe it's a small community college with not that many students. Maybe they didn't really need the lab, so they just have left it empty since their professor disappeared. So the security guard locks everything up and Nancy goes home. And the next day at breakfast, Carson Drew says he's been asked to take on a case involving Professor Hanks and her disappearance. So according to Carson, just before Sophie Hanks' death, she had succeeded in creating a simulated version of Florium pentose, which occurs rarely in plants, according to the book. But she wrote an article about it. It received little attention at the time from the scholarly community, and now Carson's client, the Foster Drug Company, has found a use for it. But the problem is her notes on the formula are incomplete, and it was patented by Professor Hanks, so the drug company would have to pay royalties. But she left no heirs behind, and she hasn't been declared legally dead because a body was never found, so she just disappeared. So I guess Carson has basically been tasked with finding any heirs that Sophie might have had, finding a will that she could have possibly written, or finding Sophie herself. That's a very tall order. Now, we do see Hannah Gruen briefly during this breakfast scene, cleaning away the breakfast dishes, and I just wrote down, I love Hannah. She's the best. So the next thing that Nancy does is she goes to talk to the head of the science department at Claremont College, Dean Tapley, and he says that Sophie Hanks was a plain and unhappy woman who had a twisted nose from a childhood accident. The book doesn't really say what the accident was, but Dean Tapley continues and he says that her students called her the old witch even though she was only in her mid-30s. Okay, when I first read this, I was like, excuse me? Mid-30s is old? I'm in my mid-30s. But anyway, he said only in her mid-30s. So I was like, okay, I'm glad that we can agree that that is not that old. Dean Tapley also says that all of Sophie's notes, like all of her formulas possibly, are still in her locker at the school, but they can't give them to the drug company because she hasn't been declared dead. So they can't go meddle in her stuff, I guess. There's a lot of legality issues with that. But he also takes this time to tell Nancy that he has met a woman named Alice Durand who has come forward, and she claims to be Sophie's niece. So he gives Nancy directions to Professor Abel Martin's office, one of Sophie's only friends, who knows where Alice is. I love when really smart people make something, like come up with some kind of patent or idea, and it's of great monetary value. There's always these people that show up and come out of the woodwork, and they're like, oh yeah, we were best friends, or I'm their second cousin twice removed or something. It's just like, there's always going to be people like that, and it looks like from this mystery, there's a lot of people that could stand to profit from Sophie's ideas. I mean, because I don't know the rules on this, but I would think that after so many years of her not showing up, like to work, that the college could technically claim her contents of her locker. I don't know about that for sure, but I feel like that would be the next step. So Nancy goes off to talk to Professor Abel Martin, who teaches literature at Claremont College, and he's quick to say that he knows nothing about science. And I was just like, I put in my notes, distancing ourselves, aren't we? Because it seems like most prime suspects are always like, I don't know anything about that, when in fact they do. It's like they like to, I don't know, I love to read into what people are saying or what they're not saying. Like you can pick up a lot of clues that way. So anyways, he went up on my suspect list, and he went up even more because he says he saw Sophie on the night of the accident, her car accident, and she had gone to a scientific seminar to share her discovery, but no one was impressed with it. And Professor Martin speculates that lack of interest was also because of her unpleasantness and appearance. And I wrote down, dang, that's a little bit harsh. Like, yeah, she has a crooked nose, but she's developed this formula that could really benefit the scientific community. But I don't know, even when I read this in fiction, it makes me a little sad because I'm like, it's so sad that people are judged on their appearances and how they look versus what they can do and give to the world. But anyways, he also drops this little tidbit of information on Nancy and says that all of Sophie's personal effects are in his garage, including some letters from another friend of hers, Vanessa Lee. And Professor Martin says that Vanessa and Sophie's relationship seemed strange to him because Vanessa was charming, attractive, and had many suitors. So the complete opposite of Sophie. Ouch. He says that Nancy can read the letters later, though, and he arranges a lunch for them and Sophie's supposed niece, Alice Durand, who is described as a slender young woman not much older than Nancy with fluffy blonde hair and long-lashed green eyes, which she kept batting flirtatiously at Abel Martin. She spoke with a sort of cowboyish southern accent that might have been pleasant except for her whiny voice. Now that's a new one. I've never heard of a cowboyish sounding accent. Like, I know what they were going for. They were trying to get this image in your head kind of, but it's like, what if we just equated people's accents to like their professions? Like, you sound like a chef or you sound like a firefighter. It's just like, okay, cowboyish. Yeehaw. So Alice claims that Sophie was her mother's half-sister, and Nancy suspects that she only reached out after hearing a news story about the missing professor and her discovery because she thought it would be profitable to do so. So Nancy's a lot like me. She's got this girl's number. So during this lunch, Nancy gets a call from Dean Tapley, and Vanessa Lee, Sophie's old friend, is in town, so he has arranged for Nancy to meet her so they can talk. So after this lunch with Professor Martin and Alice wraps up, Professor Martin checks his mail as they're leaving, and he gets a note that says, "This may sound very odd, Abel, but I have the gift of second sight. As you were lunching today, I could see a distant, radiant aura over the head of that lovely reddish-haired girl at your table. In my opinion, this means someone from the spirit world is hovering near her." Ooh, that's creepy. But you know, it's funny how Nancy is always described as lovely, even by like bystanders. Like if somebody were to write a note and I was at that table, they would have been like, yeah, that redheaded girl who has RBF face, like... So anyways, the professor writes it off as maybe someone pulling a prank from the parapsychology staff because they seem like a lively bunch that would love to play jokes on people. So next, Nancy meets Vanessa Lee, who was Sophie Hanks' friend, and she has a similar southern accent to Alice. So I thought this was suspicious. I was like, maybe these two are in cahoots and they're just trying to get this woman's fortune, you know, once these royalties pay out for this scientific discovery she made. But she apparently also forgot about Sophie until she saw a news story recently. So how convenient. What a great friend. So Nancy's not feeling too confident in this Vanessa Lee person, so she goes to Vanessa's workplace later after visiting Sophie's old apartment, where she finds no clues. But the man who hired Vanessa can't tell her much, just that they've never regretted hiring her. Just your regular workplace confidentiality mumbo jumbo, but that won't stop Nancy. But it's funny because the book says that Nancy is suspicious because Professor Martin led her to believe from Vanessa's letters that she was rich and well-traveled, and Nancy doesn't know why she would be working at a humble laboratory. You know what? Nancy shouldn't be so judgy. Maybe Vanessa just got tired of caviar and riding on yachts around, you know, the Amalfi Coast. You never know. Maybe she just wants to work in a laboratory now. So it's after this that Nancy gets a call from Professor Abel Martin, who has suddenly remembered that Professor Hanks had a cabin/shed in the woods near her apartment where she would go to write poetry. And I was like, you know, you didn't think to mention this before, maybe? I don't know. That seemed kind of suspicious. But he and Nancy go to investigate this shed, and they see a caped figure running off. And who is somebody else that we know that liked to wear capes in their lifetime? Sophie Hanks. Dun dun dun! So the person in the cape gets away, they run off, and Nancy finds some poetry and the last will and testament of Sophie Hanks in a box inside the cabin, and it says that everything is to be left to Alice Durand. So Nancy takes the will to Carson to authenticate it. I don't know, does anyone else think this is too easy? Like, we haven't found anything head nor tails of this woman, and now we finally find her will in a cabin in the middle of the woods. So the next note that I wrote down is now, all of a sudden, the night guard at the college thinks to mention to Nancy that there's another entrance to the lab. There's apparently a small door in a closet that leads to the cellar. And I'm like, why didn't you think about this when we were first investigating that light that came on? I don't know. Something tells me that that college is not very secure if that guy can't remember basic things like this. So next, Nancy goes to interview a Dr. Craig about Vanessa Lee, and he says that he not not only recommended Vanessa for the job at the laboratory, but he saved her from a boat wreck at sea. The Esmeralda went down, and Vanessa was the only survivor. So the stress caused by this traumatic accident led her to lose her memory. And so I wrote down, dang, I take back every bad thought I've had about Vanessa. I understand now. I understand why she forgot her friend Sophie, because she was dealing with this. Oh gosh, so this next part, I shouldn't laugh, but it's kind of funny because after that ordeal, apparently Vanessa, the only thing that she could say was Brahma cattle. And that, along with her accent, made them think she was from Texas. I'm sorry, I'm just picturing this woman saved out of this shipwreck wreckage, and she's just like murmuring to herself, Brahma cattle, Brahma cattle, Brahma cattle. You know, the human brain is a strange thing. I've never claimed to be able to understand it, but that just seems a little bit weird. So Carson mentions that Dr. Craig is also a plastic surgeon. He just kind of throws that out there, and so I just wrote down, okay. Now, it's at this point in the mystery when Bess and George have been following Alice Durand for Nancy. They're kind of tag teaming to see if they could see what she's up to because Nancy suspects her, and they say that she goes to Professor Martin's house, the one that she was batting her eyes at flirtatiously. Okay, and so this next note, this shocked me to my core because usually it's George that's fat-shaming Bess, but this was a little bit weird to see in this book. But Bess says she wants a snack before they leave because, you know, she's been tailing this woman for hours. She's hungry, okay? And so Nancy says, okay, but only 300 calories, Bess. So in my mind, I was like, Nancy, you just ask your best friend to hide in the bushes and tail this woman all across town for umpteen hours. You don't get to set the calorie intake. Like, I'm sorry, if I was friends with somebody that was just like, hey, make sure that you keep this meal under 500 calories, I'd be like, excuse me? What are you even, like, who talks like that, first of all? Like, ugh, it just made me cringe. But it wouldn't be a Nancy Drew book without that. So Nancy gives George some sandwiches when they find her in the bushes at Professor Martin's house, because she's been staying there, and I guess Bess took a break, but she must have been there a really long time. Like, she probably hasn't had a bathroom break or anything. She's just been sitting in the bushes for Nancy. Like, what a friend. So Nancy goes up and knocks on the door, and she confronts Professor Martin and Alice Durand, and they're both kind of like, oh, what are you doing here? We're just hanging out. And so Nancy randomly asks if she can use the professor's typewriter, but it doesn't turn out to be so random. Oh no, Nancy Drew never does anything without a purpose. So she comes back to them and she tells them she's going to compare the typing she did to that of the will that they found, and they are outraged. And Nancy also says, oh yeah, by the way, I talked to the maid who cleans Alice's hotel room, and they found a gray cape and a mask in her room. So it was Alice on the night that Nancy and Professor Martin went to the cabin. She was the one running away in the cape. They planted this fake will for Nancy to find. So of course, like most criminals, they deny that they ever did that, and Nancy, Bess, and George run off, and they see that the light is back on in the laboratory. So they find the security guard again, and they make it up to the lab just in time to witness an explosion and find Vanessa Lee laying on the floor. So Nancy approaches her and calls her Professor Hanks on a hunch, and she responds to it. So this is the point when Nancy proceeds to explain everything that she's figured out about this mystery. So Professor Hanks, devastated that the scientific community didn't appreciate her findings, crashed her car in the middle of a storm into a creek, and she was washed out of that creek and into the harbor where some boats had apparently sunk due to that same storm. She managed to pull herself into a lifeboat, but then she blacked out, and that is where Dr. Craig found her, badly injured, and assumed she was a shipwreck victim. So then he did a cosmetic surgery on her face, fixing her once broken nose. So this whole time, Vanessa was writing letters to herself. Vanessa, quote unquote, was Professor Hanks. So she was the kind of person that Professor Hanks had always wanted to be. So through her grief, she became her. This was so wild to me. This really came out of left field. I was not expecting this. Also, the missing catalyst in Professor Hanks's formula was bromate. So Nancy speculates that that was what she was murmuring when Dr. Craig found her, not Brahma cattle. So parts of the story were easy to predict, and then some of them were not. I thought this was a fairly good story. story. It was very entertaining. It kept me on the edge of my seat. This story was very Jekyll Hyde to me because, Vanessa, Professor Hanks, like she had this memory loss. It was very interesting for that aspect. So I think what I'm going to do at the end of this episode is pick my favorites of all these stories that we're talking about today. But to wrap up the Campus Ghost, for the What's Cooking segment of this story, we had Eggs Benedict, roast beef, hamburger, and a milkshake, and sandwiches. Now we'll talk about the second story in this book, The Ghost Dogs of Whispering Oaks. So, as I said earlier, this is the story that the Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake computer game is based on, so some of these character names may seem familiar to you. So, there is Sally McDonald Butler, and she recently got married to Jeff Butler. There's Ezra and Pollyanna, who are Sally's great-grandparents. Trace Saybuck, who used to be the caretaker of the estate Whispering Oaks, and Red and Jimmy Saybuck, who are his sons. So here's a brief synopsis for the Ghost Dogs of Whispering Oaks. Ever since the death of Sally's great-grandparents, their family farm has been haunted by ghost dogs. Or has it? Some gold statues of the dogs are rumored to be hidden on the property, and the dogs are said to haunt the place due to an improper burial. Can Nancy solve the case? So this story starts with Nancy, Bess, and George riding to Sally's great-grandparents' family farm. And Sally has a husband, Jeff, whereas in the game Ghost Dogs, she is just single. So Sally explains on this car ride up to the farm that she has the intentions of living here and fixing up the place because she really wants to. I mean, it was her great-grandparents' home, and there's a storm raging around the car as they're driving down this road, and a tree falls behind them. So everybody gets out of the car and they take a look at this tree, and George says it looks like the tree was deliberately cut and didn't fall because of the storm. And this is so cool because this happens in the game as well. A tree falls behind Nancy's car and she can't leave. She's just stuck there on the property. There's something so creepy about being trapped somewhere and you can't leave. So they can't turn around at this point, so they continue on and they eventually pull up to this stone farmhouse with two chimneys, Whispering Oaks. And Sally points out that there's this old ice house near the house, and then she also takes note of the fact that the barn has burned down since the last time she visited. This is also a lot like in the game, there's some things that burn down in the game, and it's just generally this house is in disrepair. So Sally is reasonably upset about this barn being burnt down, and she explains that she thinks that the property is cursed. And her great-grandparents had 4 black Labrador retrievers. And when her great-grandparents, Ezra and Pollyanna, passed away, the dogs were devastated. They refused to eat. They slowly passed away one by one. And Sally says that the caretaker, Trace Saybuck, buried them behind the ice house before the will of her great-grandparents was found. So Sally thinks that's why the dogs haunt the farm. They were supposed to be buried with Ezra and Pollyanna. And there were also apparently these solid gold casts of the dogs, which are missing. No one has been able to find them. So one cool little difference here between Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake and this story. In the game, the dogs were, I'm pretty sure, supposed to be modeled after like Rottweilers. They were very scary looking. Rottweilers get this bad reputation of being scary dogs, but they're usually really, really sweet. And I thought it was kind of interesting that they were Labradors in this story. So Sally also says that Trace Saybuck was the first person to see the ghost dogs. The night he buried them, he saw 4 pairs of glowing yellow eyes on the hillside where he buried them, and he hid in the house, and they attacked it, clawing and throwing themselves at the windows and doors. And according to his witness testimony, the witching hour or precise time that the ghost dogs come is at 9:00 p.m. That's pretty polite of them. That's pretty reasonable time to come by. It's not too late, but it's not early enough that you're expected to provide dinner for them. What would ghost dogs eat anyway? So Nancy, Bess, George, and Sally go into the farmhouse, and it's very dusty. They try to kind of spruce it up. They make dinner, and they start a fire in the fireplace. And it's while they're doing this that the door just blows open and smacks into the far wall. And Sally shrieks, and she's scared because she just got done telling them about this curse and these ghost dogs, so she's on edge. And so Nancy proposes that they play a word game to distract themselves. But it's funny because Bess and George just look at her like she's crazy. Like, Nancy, we don't want to play Scrabble. We're terrified right now. But they do. They start playing this word game, and not long after playing, they start hearing these howls in the woods. woods. So the girls all go to look out the windows, and they see these 4 pairs of glowing yellow eyes floating in the darkness, and then these inky black figures just launch themselves at the windows, clawing and snarling until slowly the sounds fade and turn into distant howling in the woods. Very creepy. But Nancy starts to go outside to investigate, but Sally begs her not to, so she waits until the next morning. And let me tell you, okay, if you've ever played the computer game, I was terrified to leave the house after that happened. After they attacked, I was like, no, I'm not going out in the daylight. I'm not going out at nighttime. I'm never leaving this house again, okay? Actually, if you've seen one of my more recent reels on Instagram about Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake, that was totally my reaction as a child. I was like, nope, I am terrified. So Nancy eventually goes into the woods the next morning, and she swears that she hears whispers, but then she realizes that it must be the wind between the trees. So she's like, that's how Whispering Oaks got its name. But she explores the property, and Nancy finds the dog's gravestones near the ice shack after following a track of paw prints. And their names, get this, their names are very weird. They are Kosob, Shros, Dragons, and Neskane. When I first read this, I was like, what? Like, these are not exactly the easiest names that you would want to yell out at the dog park. Like, here, Novocaine, come over here, it's time to put your leash back on. Neskane, Novocaine. But it's funny because in the game, the dogs' names are very different. They are Lucy, Xander, Vitus, and Iggy. So Nancy speculates that the tracks are human-made. She thinks someone is trying to make these look like dog tracks. But a ghost couldn't have made them. She's already determined that. She's like, I don't believe in ghosts. This has to have an explanation. So it's while she's out here looking at these gravestones and these tracks that she spots 2 men talking in the woods. So she sneaks closer to hear them, and she overhears one of them say, "You'd better buy plenty of them. We don't need trouble with those girls here." That's kind of strange. But then Nancy accidentally steps on a branch, and there's a cracking noise. And so the men scatter, and Nancy chases them, but they disappear. So she goes back to the ice house to take a closer look at it, and then she gets shoved in from behind. So meanwhile, Bess, George, and Sally are in the house, and they wake up and they realize that Nancy's not there, so they panic and go outside looking for her. And they eventually hear her yelling, and they find her down in the bottom of this ice house, like it's all, the floorboards are rotten, and Sally throws a flashlight down to Nancy when they find her and save her. But before she climbs up the rope, she notices that there's all these holes missing. Stones from the walls and floors are just gone. Almost as if someone was searching for something. Because we know that, a barn may burn down, but stones don't just walk away. Stones are here forever. They last through pretty much anything. So someone has purposefully been removing these stones. So after Nancy gets out of the hole, she asks Sally about the 2 men she saw in the woods, and Sally says they are Jimmy and Red Saybuck, who are Trass's sons, the old caretaker they used to have who passed away, and the sons are just kind of taking over where he left off. Let me tell you, there are some weird names in this book, but I thought Red was interesting because we have, of course, the character of Red Knott in the computer game. So Sally says that they trust them completely and they watch over the farm. And I said, okay, red flag. I just wrote down in my notes, never trust the creepy caretakers, because it's always the creepy caretakers, it's just like they always have an axe to grind in these Nancy Drew books. I don't know what it is. And apparently they just ground that axe into that tree that fell across the driveway. That's my theory anyway. So together the 4 girls go look at the dog's tombstones, and they read the inscription there, and it says, "Whosoever loves us shall hold us forever through the pages of time." And it's while they're standing at the gravestones that George also noticed that several hastily dug holes have been covered up, which is suspicious. Someone must be looking for the golden statues on the property. So the girls walk back to the farmhouse, and Nancy begins to wonder if the clue to the inscription and the treasure may be in the library in the house. Pages of time, books have pages, and Nancy kind of wonders if there's a clue to the dog's strange names in there too. So it's while she's telling the girls this, she hears something outside and wonders if someone is eavesdropping in on them. And she checks, but no one is there. But shortly after, though, just a few minutes later, Red Saybuck knocks on the door and tells Sally her husband Jeff has been delayed because of car problems. And when Sally asks him about all the holes on the property, he just says, girls who stay in haunted houses often imagine things or exaggerate them, which makes George really mad. So Nancy doesn't believe these hauntings for a second. Like, even though she witnessed it with her own eyes, she's like, there's got to be more to this. So she devises a plan for her and George to hide outside to get a closer look at the ghost dogs. So before 9 o'clock, Nancy and George go outside and they hide, and Nancy sees the eyes appear over the headstones, but she steps on a branch again. So they come running at her and she tries to flee but falls. And when she gets up, she's face to face with these glowing eyes, and then something hits her over the head and she blacks out. Ghost Dogs 1, Nancy Drew 0. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, the door starts to open and Bess screams and throws a flashlight at it because she doesn't know what's happening. She thinks, oh no, the ghost dogs are coming in the house. But it's just Jeff, Sally's husband, and they're surprised to see him because they didn't think he was going to make it until later or even the next day, according to the Saybuck brothers. But Jeff tells them something alarming. He says he told Red he'd arrive at noon, but he didn't pass that message along to the girls. So the Saybuck brothers just neglected to tell Nancy, Bess, George, and Sally about that. But why? And Jeff also ran into Jimmy at a local store in town buying batteries. So this could explain what Nancy overheard earlier about buying more of them because the girls were going to cause trouble while they were at the house. In other words, these girls are going to get in the way of our treasure hunting. And according to Jeff, there was a deliberate hole in his gas tank. That's what was wrong with his car, his so-called car problems. And the tree was still across the road, even though Sally had asked Red to move it. So that delayed Jeff even further. He had to walk up the road and couldn't take his car. So Nancy, meanwhile, wakes up after being hit over the head to find her and George have been tied up in a closet, and she can hear angry voices outside. And it's while she's coming to that she remembers what she saw before she blacked out. 2 men wearing all black with glowing yellow lights on their hands. So the ghost dogs are really the Saybuck brothers who have been scaring people off so they can find the treasure. So Nancy overhears Red say that the girls know too much and he's going to burn the cabin down with them in it. But Jimmy says they can't do that, so they're out there arguing, and Nancy is able to untie herself and George in the meantime. And once they get out of the closet, they see that the brothers have disappeared, and she puts out a fire in an ashtray that the brothers started. And it's then that she realizes that Jimmy actually tied their bonds loose enough that they could escape, and he poured water instead of gasoline so the house wouldn't go up in flames as quickly. It's at this point when Jeff shows up to help with George, so he helps carry her out of the house, and when they get back to the farmhouse, Whispering Oaks, they see Red running away with a book and an axe, but the police catch him and take him and Jimmy away. It's then that Nancy explains that Red was really close to figuring out the mystery. She explains that the dogs' names could be rearranged to say books, canines, gardens, and horses, and when they look behind those particular shelves in the library, they find a door that they can pry open, and there's 4 gold dog statues. So for the What's Cooking segment of the Ghost Dogs of Whispering Oaks, we had lamb chops with mint sauce, mashed potatoes, string beans, and apple crisp. Now on to our third ghost story, Blackbeard's Skull. So some of the characters that we encounter in Blackbeard's Skull are Ranger Lane, Arthur Huber, who is an assistant to Ranger Lane, Colin Hudson, who is just quote-unquote British sailor guy, George Haybob, who is a banjo player / singer, and Gerald Curran, who is a World War II buff and scuba diver. So here is a brief synopsis for the short story Blackbeard's Skull. Nancy, Bess, and George are in North Carolina to see some doubloons owned by Blackbeard, but they've gone missing and a skull has been left in their place. Is it the curse of Blackbeard or meddling by some modern-day foe? So this story starts with Nancy, Bess, and George off the coast of North Carolina at a place called Pelican Island, and they're going to be shown some doubloons that were rumored to be Blackbeard's. So this is really cool because Blackbeard's ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, has actually been found off of the coast of North Carolina, I think near Ocracoke Island, I think that's how you say it. But I would love to do this on a trip, like to go investigate like pirate lore. I had a pirate stage when I was in high school, okay? It was around the time that Pirates of the Caribbean came out, majorly dating myself here, but Love pirates, love pirate legends. So the person that's going to show Nancy, Bess, and George these doubloons is this guy named Roger Lane, but when he opens the museum building up to them, the doubloons are gone, and there's a skull that's been left in their place. Of course, Ranger Lane is pretty distraught about this, and he says it's rumored that there is a curse on Blackbeard's treasure, so he just kind of drops that on them, but he also says he was the only one with a key other than his assistant, Arthur Huber, who he trusts implicitly. So Nancy searches around the outside of the building, outside of the museum, and she runs straight into this elderly man who's just hanging out outside, which was kind of weird, kind of suspicious. But he says his name is Colin Hudson, and he is a British sailor who was around the area during World War II and was on a ship called the Lancaster that was sunken by U-boats. And he explains to Nancy that he was coming by to see the site of the shipwreck and honor his fellow fallen sailors. So Nancy invites him to dinner later. So after meeting Colin, Nancy goes back inside the museum and she takes a closer look at the skull that was left in place of the doubloons, and she notices that one tooth has a filling. Pirates weren't really known for going to the dentist, so that's a little bit odd. So Nancy files that information away for later, and Ranger Lane says he would love any help that she can give on this case because she is a detective. But Nancy goes back to the cottage that she and Bess and George are staying at, and they start preparing dinner, but Mr. Hudson never shows up. Nancy's a little bit concerned about this because he is a little bit older, it's starting to get dark, and he's not familiar with the area, so thinking he must be lost, Nancy takes a walk on the island and finds herself at the British Sailors' Cemetery. So while she's there, she just kind of looks around at the memorial to the sailors of the Lancaster sinking, and she finds Colin Hudson's name is listed as one of the deceased. So this is really weird because Nancy is like, I just talked to this man earlier. He was as real as you or me, and yet his name is on this list for this memorial. He's listed as deceased. So she's kind of like, is somebody impersonating him? Like, Nancy will always try to find a solution that's logical rather than believe in ghosts. So Nancy never does find Mr. Hudson, but she does run into a man named George Haybab, who Ranger Lane had mentioned to her earlier in the day, and he's a banjo player and a singer, and he says he writes songs about the history of the island and was sad about watching the sailors wash up on the beach in 1942 after the Lancaster sank. So next, Nancy goes to the Coast Guard station and she asks them if they've seen a man fitting the description of Mr. Hudson, and they say they haven't, but they do tell her of a man named Gerald Curran, who is a World War II buff who lives in the area. He also scuba dives out in the bay, and maybe he could help. So Nancy goes back to Bess and George, and they just decide to eat dinner because Mr. Hudson has not appeared, and afterwards, Nancy goes to meet Mr. Curran. She's figuring, well, I may as well go talk to him, but he's super rude to her and says he's never met Mr. Hudson in his life, and when Nancy asks him about scuba diving in World War II, he's really elusive about it. I mean, granted, it's late at night and Nancy's this stranger who's knocking on his door. That would be kind of annoying, but it is also kind of strange because, you know, this is something that he enjoys doing, a hobby. You would think that he would want to talk about that with pretty much anybody. So the next day, Nancy decides to go out in this boat to the Lancaster shipwreck, and she goes alone, which I said, not smart, Nancy, but she sees Mr. Gerald Curran is there, and he seems annoyed with her. He doesn't like the fact that she's there. And my response to this would be, it's a free country, and I'm pretty sure that extends to the waterways, at least like, I don't know, so many miles off the coast, but this guy is obviously up to something and he doesn't want Nancy around to see what he's doing. But Nancy, of course, having the social cues of a fish, or she just doesn't care, she just decides to anchor her boat right there because she's like, I have just as much right to be at this shipwreck as this guy does, and she scuba dives down to the ship, and she sees this huge hole in the side that apparently was made by a submarine's torpedo, and that's how the Lancaster sank. But when she swims inside the hole to investigate, a headless skeleton falls on her. So I read this and I freaked out. I was like, no. Like, props to you guys that like to scuba dive and can scuba dive. Like, I would possibly... No, I don't think I would try it. I just changed my mind. I don't know. It's just something about the water freaks me out. Like, I love looking at shipwrecks and videos and stuff, but to actually be there and then to actually have a skeleton fall on you like that would be so scary. But Nancy, of course, is freaking freaked out about this, and she swims back up to the surface, and she's convinced that Gerald Curran had something to do with it because he's no longer on his boat, and she's just wondering if he dropped the skeleton on her. So Nancy goes back to the cottage, and her and George call around to hotels and cottages trying to find Mr. Hudson again because they haven't seen him or heard from him, so they're kind of worried about him. But no one by that name is staying anywhere in town. So while Nancy and George are out, Bess is by herself at the cottage, and Mr. Curran comes around, and Bess says that he was being very nosy, wanting to know what Nancy was up to. This guy seems a little bit suspicious, but also, like, I would get so annoyed with suspects like this. I'd be like, you won't tell me what you're up to, so why do you want to know what I'm up to? So Nancy rides her bike to go get some fish for dinner, and someone in a park ranger truck just runs her off the road. And she goes to Ranger Lane's house immediately after because she could have gotten really hurt. Luckily, she just got a couple scratches and bruises because she's Nancy Drew, and she doesn't have to go to the hospital. But she goes there and asks him, like, who was driving that ranger truck, and he says he'll check and see who it was assigned to. And while she's there, Nancy also convinces him to let her borrow the key to the ranger station so she can investigate it later that night. So later that night, Nancy goes to the ranger station by herself. Again, I said dumb, Nancy, not the right move. You should have had Bess or George go with you. But she finds a cleverly hidden trapdoor underneath Arthur Huber, the assistant's desk. The one that Ranger Lane said, oh, I trust that guy. He's so nice and honest. Well, guess what? He's not. He's a liar. He sits on a throne of lies. He apparently also sits over a trapdoor, so. But this explains how somebody was able to get the doubloons out without using the key. So Nancy's looking through the trapdoor and down at the water when someone hits her from behind and she blacks out, falling into the water below. See, this is why it would have been better if someone had come with her. They could have even waited outside. I don't know. Just me thinking out loud. So when Nancy finally comes to, she's bound and gagged across from none other than Colin Hudson on the boat. So he had been missing all this time. Apparently this is where he was. And she hears Arthur Huber, Ranger Lane's assistant, and Gerald Curran arguing on another part of the boat. Something tells me they're not going to come back from this 3-hour tour. So Gerald says he's going to dive down to the wreckage of the Lancaster and get the doubloons, and so he leaves Mr. Huber alone to watch Nancy and Colin Hudson. But that's where they hid the doubloons, was just on the shipwreck, and that's why he didn't want Nancy poking around it the other day. So meanwhile, Bess and George have become worried about Nancy because they realize that she's disappeared and they don't know where she is. You should have left a note, Nancy. But they have alerted the Coast Guard. Now meanwhile, back on the boat, Nancy has maneuvered to where she's close to the ship's horn, and so she taps out SOS on it. And Mr. Huber gets so mad he yells at her and he says he'll throw her overboard if she does anything like that again. But the damage has already been done, so the Coast Guard. I was trying to say Coast Guard, but wouldn't that be a funny costume, like a very punny costume? You could dress up as a pumpkin and wear an orange vest and be like, I'm a member of the Coast Guard. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, if it's not the #1 costume this year, it's not my fault. Anyways, the Coast Guard stops to investigate, and Huber lies and said, oh, it was an accident. I didn't mean to tap out SOS on the ship horn, like as if you could accidentally do that. But Nancy sticks her foot up in front of a porthole to get their attention because she's still tied up, so she's maneuvering like a gymnast here. She's like trying to scooch up the wall and sticks her foot up there, but they grab Huber and they rescue her and untie her. So Nancy explains to the Coast Guard how Huber and Curran were working together, and they cut a hole in the floor of the ranger station and snuck the doubloons out that way. And Mr. Hudson also interjects that he met Mr. Curran and he offered to take him out to the Lancaster. And Mr. Hudson knew the ship very well, and he spotted the gold doubloons instantly, so Mr. Curran refused to let him go because he knew too much. Nancy also says that the skull they planted at the ranger station was from one of the sailors' bodies at the Lancaster because, the filling in the tooth, it couldn't have been a pirate's skull because they wouldn't have had fillings back then. And needless to say, this upsets Mr. Hudson to hear since these were the bodies of his fellow sailors that he knew. So that skull at the ranger station came off of the headless skeleton that was dropped on Nancy when she was swimming around the shipwreck. So I thought that this was like some kind of, oh, we got a skeleton at Party City and we're going to drop it on Nancy and scare her in the water. Like, the fact that it's an actual real body is so terrible. That's really messed up. And not even that, but to take it even further, it's like this is the body of somebody who fought in World War II. So this is a veteran's skeleton. So later, after Huber and Curran have been taken into custody, Ranger Lane prepares a thank you dinner for Nancy, Bess, George, and Mr. Colin Hudson. And he also takes them to George Habab, the guy who sings ballads and plays on the banjo. And he sings the ballad of Nancy Drew and Blackbeard. And I said it's too bad that the lyrics weren't included in the book because it made me think of the Nancy Drew rap from Secrets Can Kill. I'm picturing like a sea shanty or something, like, yo ho, Nancy Drew, she solved the mystery of the doubloons and she solves every mystery that her mind is put to. It's not gonna chart the top 40, but you know what I mean. But here's where this mystery gets really spooky. Even spookier than my singing. Colin Hudson, the guy who happened to have the same name as one of the deceased sailors on the Lancaster Memorial, just disappears. He's nowhere to be found, and Nancy even speculates, and we know Nancy does not believe in ghosts. She wonders if perhaps he had a troubled soul and he came back to help her figure out what was going on with the stolen doubloons and at the wreckage of the Lancaster. Oh my gosh, and you know what I just realized? I just now realized this. I bet that was his body. I bet that was his skull and his skeleton that was desecrated, because he pops up right outside of the ranger station right after Nancy sees the skull. Oh my gosh, that's so creepy. Like, that puts a whole nother spin on this story. Wow, that's dark. So for the What's Cooking segment of Blackbeard's Skull, we had mentionings of coquina chowder, which I guess is clam chowder, grilled tomato, cheese, and onion sandwiches, scrambled eggs, cornbread and bacon, and bluefish. On to our next story, The Ghost Jogger. So in this story, we really just have one character other than the main characters, and his name is Pete. It's pretty simple. Here's a quick synopsis for The Ghost Jogger. Nancy encounters a mysterious figure in a cape on a jog that passes her cryptic notes. Could it have something to do with 2 missing children in the area, and can Nancy solve the case? So Nancy, Bess, and George join this group of joggers at a park in River Heights, and they're apparently doing this for fun. I don't know, I can't relate. But they get separated on their jog, and Nancy notices at one point that she's jogging next to someone in a white cape with a hood, and she thinks to herself, weird jogging outfit. Yeah, I think if I went for a jog and I saw somebody come up next to me with a cape, I would probably be terrified and run even faster in the other direction. So while Nancy's jogging, this figure passes her a note and she unfolds it as she runs. I'm just picturing this. This is so chaotic to me. Like, I can just imagine Nancy out of breath, just like, and then she gets this note from this person and she's like, what is this? I don't have time for this right now. And no, before you can guess, it's not from a secret admirer, because you would think it was, the way that Nancy's always described as being attractive and lovely in all of the books, and she's always getting hit on by random people. No, it's not a secret admirer. So the note actually says, Nancy, find them in the empty barn with the flaming horse on it, signed the family ghost. Okay, so that's a bit cryptic. I don't know what that means, but Nancy doesn't either. So she starts to ask the figure what it means, but they've just disappeared. So Nancy runs back home and she tells Hannah what happened, and Hannah says, oh, that's weird because there's these 2 children that have been missing. It's been all over the news, and so they wonder if this could be connected to the figure's note that Nancy has. So the next day, Nancy and George go in search of a barn with a red horse on it, because that's what the note said to do. And when they find it, which they found it really fast, I was really surprised, they see a woman and 2 men shoving 2 kids into a car. The kidnapped kids and their captors. So Nancy and George try to pursue them, but they run out of gas. Nancy's car just sputters to a stop. That's unfortunate. So Nancy decides to go on another jog. If nothing else, this mystery is going to get her in really good shape. She's going to have the cardio endurance of an Olympian. But she encounters the figure again, and this time she receives a note that says, thank you for your hard work. Too bad it ended the way it did. Now try the riverboat with the old sea captain. Thank goodness it's Nancy getting these notes, because if it was me, I would crumple it up and throw it in the trash. I'd be like, this is too cryptic, this is too much work, what do you want from me? But I don't know. Maybe if I knew there was kidnapped kids at stake, I might work a little bit harder. So Nancy asks her dad about it, and Carson said, oh yeah, there was this old boat called the Magnolia. It's just out in the river now. It's, abandoned. How convenient. An abandoned boat. This seems exactly like the place kidnappers would hang out. So Nancy takes Bess and George on a morning jog, hoping that she'll see the ghost jogger again and get another clue as to what to do, but they don't. So apparently he just shows up at night. But next she takes them to this dock where they're going to take a boat out to talk to some guy named Pete, who Ned Nickerson knows. I love how there's no shortage of strange characters like this in Nancy Drew books. It's like, oh yeah, that random guy Pete who, he lives on the Muskoka River. He knows the river's like the back of his hand. It's like, okay, I'll buy that. It's so funny to me, though, because I had to take note of this. Bess jokes about it when they go down to the dock and she's not really quite sure why they're there yet. She asks Nancy if Carson bought her a boat. Bess is so real for this because Nancy has the best of everything. She's got a new car, and if she wrecks it, Carson buys her another one. So, it's fair game that she asks Nancy, like, hey, is your dad buying you a boat? And Nancy's like, no. But also, Nancy is the last person that needs a boat, let's be honest. So they go meet River Pete, and he takes them to the old abandoned ship, the Magnolia, which is supposedly abandoned, but there's a light on board, and they hear a kid scream. So Nancy boards the boat, and she sees men taking the children away, and she also sees the ghost jogger again. He's just on the boat, and he says, get your boat and follow me to the old boathouse. Well, okay then. So Nancy obeys and gets back on her boat to chase the kidnappers, and the ghost follows in their own boat. And so while they're riding boats next to each other, Nancy shouts over to the ghost, who has the children? And the ghost just replies, my Uncle Clark, he's determined to get some ransom money. So that solves part of the mystery. The ghost jogger is related to one of the kidnappers and has a moral dilemma over him kidnapping these kids. But the kidnapper's boat goes into a boathouse and they follow, but this metal door comes down on half of their boat, separating Nancy and Pete from Bess and George. And it was apparently late at night when I was reading this, because my next note is just, how does the boat not sink though? Like when this metal door comes halfway down on it, how does it not just capsize in the middle and just sink? And thank goodness no one was cut in half, But Nancy ends up able to rescue the kids, and the ghost turns out to be the nephew of the kidnapper, John Clark. But I don't think we actually get the ghost jogger's name. He's just related to this guy. And so he was scared of going to the police initially because of his relatives, so he contacted Nancy instead. And that's the end. This was kind of a weird one, I'm not gonna lie. And there's actually no What's Cooking segment for the ghost jogger. We were too busy jogging to cook, I guess. Now on to the fifth mystery, The Curse of the Frog. So some of the characters we see in this short story are Madame Zerga, Mary Lukash, who is a local gypsy, Nikki Lamar, Yvette Lamar, who is her cousin, and a Mr. Karnak. Here's a brief synopsis for The Curse of the Frog. Nancy is approached by her friend and a local gypsy, Mary Lukash, who is concerned that another gypsy, Madame Zerga, is giving all gypsies in River Heights a bad name through her fraudulent practices, and because she keeps threatening to put the frog curse on people. Can Nancy get to the bottom of things and help her friend? So at the beginning of this story, Nancy's approached by her friend Mary Lukash, who's this local gypsy in River Heights, and she's concerned because there's this lady named Madame Zerga, this other gypsy, who she thinks is just going to give all the gypsies in River Heights a bad name. She's been threatening to curse people with this frog after her palm readings and crystal ball readings. So Nancy decides to go see this for herself. So she goes to Madame Zerga's fortune-telling parlor, and she notices that the eyes of a picture move, and the gypsy can spy on her clients while they're in the waiting room. But eventually, Nancy is called into the inner sanctum, and the incense is so strong that she feels woozy. And Madame Zerga asks Nancy to hold this taxidermy frog while she does her reading, and she starts asking very invasive questions about Carson's cases and the combination to their safe at their house. And Madame Zerga tells Nancy not to dare drop that frog, but Nancy drops the frog and leaves because she's so freaked out. And she says that the frog seemed to come to life in her hand, which is really gross. So next, Nancy runs into Nikki Lamar, a friend of hers, coming out of the fortune teller's parlor. And Nikki says that her cousin Yvette has been going to Madame Zerga for a while now, and she's been on edge and very unnerved about frogs. I wonder why. But she asks Nancy to come stay with them and see if she can figure out what's going on with Yvette. So when Nancy gets over to the Lamar's house, Yvette talks about how she was from the West Indies, and she randomly talks about this fireplace that her uncle built himself in their house. And I thought, okay, this is probably going to be important to the mystery. But Nancy stays the night, and in the middle of the night, there's this scream, and it's Yvette. So Nancy and Nikki go to her room, and there's a frog apparition on the window croaking. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. If you're afraid of frogs, I mean, I just think they're slimy and kind of gross, but if you're afraid of frogs, I'm sorry. I could not take this seriously. But eventually, the apparition fades away, and Nancy and Nikki try to calm Yvette down with some hot cocoa and talk about the experience. And Yvette says she wasn't afraid of frogs until going to Madame Zerga. She says the fortune teller asked her invasive questions, just like she did Nancy, and Yvette tells the girls that her uncle told her something just before he died. And what he said was, 7 stones tell the truth, but it is better that my secret remain bottled up forever. Stones? Stones on a fireplace, perhaps? So, unfortunately, Yvette told Madame Zerga this riddle in her weakness during this session that they had, and she gave her a bottle of stones that belonged to her uncle. And at first I was like, great, you just gave probably some untold fortune to this fortune teller. But Nancy notices about that time that there's exactly 7 stones on the fireplace that have ships carved on them, and they're in this weird upside down V formation. So, of course, we don't do anything with that information now. Everybody goes back to bed. But the next day, this weird guy named Mr. Karnak shows up, claiming that he's a journalist with an interior decorating magazine, and he asks to take pictures of the fireplace. And they just let this guy inside. Like, he doesn't give the name of the magazine, doesn't say how he heard about the fireplace. I'm sorry, red flag. So then, of course, what does he start to do? After he takes pictures of these stones, he starts trying to pry them out with a knife, and Nancy stops him. And he gets hostile and says he doesn't have to show her his credentials. Maybe not, but you have a knife and you need to get out of our house. So he leaves, and later that night, Yvette shows Nancy her uncle's room, which has been left the same since his death. And there's a bunch of sailor knickknacks in there, and Nancy sees a ship in a bottle. Could that be the bottle mentioned in the riddle? So Nancy takes a closer look at it, and the ship inside the bottle is actually named the Frog. Weird. And suddenly it's then that Yvette remembers another possible reason why she could be scared of frogs. So back when she lived in the West Indies, she went searching for her uncle after playing on the beach one day, and she looked into this cave, and she saw a bunch of grown men with heads of frogs on them sitting around a fire. And one was her uncle, and he pulled his mask off. Okay, so this either seems like a weird pastime or a cult. Yvette's uncle has strange hobbies. So next, Nancy examines the stones on the fireplace, and she finds a faint carving of a frog, so she pushes it, and a bookcase across the room swings open. I love when we can find a secret passageway. But anyways, there are steps going down into this chamber, and Yvette and the girls find this box with a stone frog on top of it, and underneath a boat hook and cutlass, and when they look inside, they find jewels. But they don't have long to celebrate, because Mr. Karnak, the phony photographer, is back. I knew I didn't like that guy. So he has a weapon, but it doesn't say what kind of weapon in the book. It could be a gun, it could be a knife, I don't really know. But he and Madame Zerga come down the stairs, and they say they're going to take the jewels and leave the girls in the secret room to rot. But Nancy warns them of the frog curse. Then a frog comes hopping towards them down the passageway, and this freaks Madame Zerga and Mr. Karnak out. But then Ned and Bert show up literally out of nowhere and knock the bad guys down. Like, what? So this kind of seems out of left field, like Ned and Bert just appearing out of nowhere, but it is explained in the book because Nancy goes off like to run some errands at one point, and that's when she calls Ned and Bert. But she explains that she figured out that the house was being bugged, and there was a projector in the tree outside that made the frog image on Yvette's window. So she had Ned buy a toy frog and put a tape in it that made frog noises, and then she told him to come by earlier in the day. It's a bit convoluted, but it's a Nancy Drew story, so we'll go with it. But it turns out, after reading the note with the jewels, because there was a note in that box with the jewels, Yvette discovers that her uncle was part of a pirate gang that robbed ships, get this, while wearing frog masks. I have officially read it all. You know what? I bet seeing those grown men in frog masks swinging onto boats and robbing people made for a very riveting sight. Ribbit. I'm so stupid. But also, like, how did they communicate? Did they use Morse code? Okay, I'll stop. It also turns out that Mr. Karnak was a member of the Frog Pirates, and he was mad that Yvette's uncle took the treasure and left. So that's why he was like seeking revenge and to find the jewels or whatever. But anyways, the bad guys are arrested and Yvette is going to try and return the jewels to their proper owners, I guess. So as far as the What's Cooking segment for The Curse of the Frog, we had a mentioning of tea, orangeade, and cocoa. So we drank a lot of liquids in this story. Now on to our sixth and final story of this Ghost Stories Volume 1, The Greenhouse Ghost. Now, some of the characters that we encounter in the Greenhouse Ghost are the LaForges, who are these orchid owners, Joe Hendricks, their gardener, and Kiki, who is Joe Hendricks, the gardener's assistant. Here's a brief synopsis for the Greenhouse Ghost. Nancy is tasked by Carson to figure out if a ghost is really haunting the greenhouse of a property that's for sale. Is it ghostly interference or villainous sabotage? So this short story opens up with Carson asking Nancy if she'll investigate a property he's managing for the bank. The LaForge estate is up for sale by the heirs. So the LaForges owned this orchid selling business and they recently passed away, but the greenhouse on the property of their home is said to be haunted and it's stalling the sale of the house. Carson actually jokes that he'll buy it for Nancy, which I thought was kind of funny because, I mean, he's always like, they're always joking about buying properties and cars and boats and all kinds of stuff. Oh, to be them. So Nancy, Carson, and Togo go out to the estate to check it out, and the LaForges named their house, like that's how you know you're rich, if you name your house, but they named it Orchidiana, like orchid and Iana. I was like, that sounds like something you would name a state between Indiana and Ohio. And Carson also says that Mr. LaForge was on his way to cross-pollinating and figuring out how to make a blue species of orchid, which would have rocked the plant world to its core. So they get to this estate, Orchidiana, and they're introduced to Joe Hendricks, who's the gardener, and his assistant Kiki, and they tour the greenhouse, but when they get to the house, they see this ghost with long white hair holding a beaker full of blue liquid. So creepy. So Kiki and Joe, ever the brave tour guides, take off and leave the Drews alone with this ghost. So the ghost does take off, but Nancy finds a drop of the blue liquid on the floor, and it feels tacky and kind of sticky like glue. And she also discovers there's a laboratory, and she can see where someone has been conducting experiments. But while she's up there, Joe Hendricks, the gardener, comes up behind her and he gets all defensive, and he tells Nancy to get out of there when he sees her taking pictures. So Nancy wonders about this female ghost, and she asks Carson if there are any women connected to the estate, and he says that Kiki's wife was the estate secretary and some money was left to her, and she apparently got more money in the settlement than Joe Hendricks did. I'm just gonna hazard a guess and say that's a point of contention between them. So Nancy goes back up to the laboratory and she finds a white wig, so probably the one that the ghost was wearing, and she finds a serial number and the letter L on the wig lining, meaning it was rented from a place called Lomax Beauty Salon in River Heights. So Nancy goes by the salon and she's able to see that someone with the last name Hendricks rented the wig. Maybe Joe Hendricks' wife, perhaps? Now this next note is just something funny that I wrote down, but George teases Nancy that Orchidiana, the estate, would be a great place for her and Ned to settle down. So Nancy, Bess, and George next cook dinner and they hang out at Orchidiana, which that's gotta be creepy. I would not want to hang out there, but they get disturbed by this screeching cat and other noises, and then eventually they see the ghost again. So Nancy chases after the ghost through the greenhouse, but it gets away. But when she goes shows up to the laboratory, she finds the wig and it's warm, so someone was wearing it recently. So it's while Nancy's taking a closer look at this wig, a woman enters the lab, and it's Miss Hendricks, Joe Hendricks' wife, and she accuses Nancy of spying on her and shoves her out of the lab and locks herself inside. Well, that's not odd behavior at all. So Nancy picks up a phone in the hallway to call her father, but is disturbed by a voice on the line saying, "Miss Hendricks?" So Nancy, on a hunch, asks if anything is new, and the man, who is named Ed Smith with a Y, says he's willing to meet her husband's offer. So when Nancy finally talks to Carson about Ed Smith, he says this man owns a rival orchid company. So Kiki and Nancy are experimenting on orchids in the lab, and Miss Hendricks gets mad when she finds this out. I guess she just doesn't like them poking around on the property, but she's starting to come to the lab to check out what Nancy and Kiki are doing, so Bess and George warn them that she's coming, and so she just locks Kiki and Nancy in this thing called the cold room, where the flowers are stored, and sets the temperature on freezing. Luckily though, George and Bess eventually get them out before they freeze to death, but at this point Nancy has a plan. So she decides that she's going to dress up as the ghost, and she scares Miss Hendricks while she's pretending to be the ghost. So this reminded me a lot of the revised text for Lilac Inn, how Nancy was dressing up and, scaring Gay Moreau, who was also dressing up as a ghost. It was very reminiscent of that. So Mr. and Miss Hendricks are caught, Kiki figures out the blue orchid formula, and that's the end of this mystery. So there's not really a what's cooking segment for this short story, The Greenhouse Ghost. They didn't really do any cooking. They were too busy mixing up formulas and trying to figure out, how to cross-pollinate. But I have to say, I really enjoyed some of these short stories. They weren't super scary, but they were just kind of ghosty and kind of just hokey enough and perfect just in time for Halloween. But if I had to pick my favorite stories from Nancy Drew Ghost Stories Volume 1, I would probably say The Campus Ghost or The Ghost Dogs of Whispering Oaks. I loved those two. So yeah, I want to know what your favorite stories were from this episode. You can let me know on my Instagram, which is True Drew Podcast, and make sure you guys tune in next Monday for the second bonus Halloween episode, where we'll be discussing Nancy Drew Ghost Stories Volume 2. Stay spooky.